Take a white paper towel out to the garden with you this evening. Just an ordinary one, off the roll by the kitchen sink. Find the ugliest leaf on your hollyhocks. Turn it over. Press the towel flat against the underside and rub, gently. Now look at the towel. If there is a smear of orange on it, rust-colored, like brick dust, then that leaf is not tired. That leaf is still working. And what it is working on has almost nothing to do with this summer. Now, about that title up at the top of the screen. September 1st is not a magic date. There is no biological clock buried in your flower bed that goes off on the last day of August. And a gardener outside Duluth and a gardener outside Baton Rouge are living in two different seasons on the very same calendar page. But here is why the date still matters, and why I want you outside this week. Before that page turns, walk down the bed and inspect these 7 plants, one at a time, and decide which ones actually need a sanitation cut. Because on the wrong plant, leaving diseased or infested foliage standing does not simply look untidy. It carries the problem forward into next year. That is the whole idea behind this video, and I want to say it plainly before we go any further. You are not cutting a perennial because it looks bad. You are cutting it because that particular tissue, on that particular plant, has become infrastructure for next year's disease or next year's insect. Housekeeping and pest management look identical from the driveway. They are not the same job. And that is exactly why so many people clean up faithfully every single fall and still fight the same mildew, the same rust, the same chewed leaves every single spring. So we are going to walk the bed together. 7 plants. For each one I will give you the verdict first, cut or wait, and then tell you why. 3 things to watch for along the way. 1 plant on this list turns brown every August, and it is almost never disease, and there is a 10-second test that tells you the difference. 2 very popular perennials that nearly every cleanup list tells you to cut right now, which I am going to ask you to leave completely alone. And 1 small habit people fall into immediately after cutting, with the best intentions in the world, that can undo the whole afternoon. Let us start. Columbine. The one with the little nodding flowers. By late August, Columbine leaves often look like somebody doodled on them with a fine white pen. Wandering pale lines, tan at the edges, curling back on themselves. Verdict first. Cut it if flowering is long finished, if more than half the leaves are mined and ragged, and if you can see small fresh growth down at the crown. If the plant still looks reasonably good, leave it alone. This damage is mostly cosmetic, and it is not going to kill your columbine. So why cut it all? Because of what those lines actually are. Inside that leaf, between the top surface and the bottom, a small fly larva is eating its way along a tunnel. The doodle is a feeding trail. When the larva finishes, it chews its way out and drops down to pupate. And here is the part that saves you money. You cannot spray that. Once the larva is tucked inside the leaf, a contact insecticide simply does not reach it. You would also likely be killing the tiny parasitic wasps that are already working that plant for free. So the tool here is not a bottle. It is a pair of shears, used before the larvae leave. And do not confuse those pale winding lines with something else. A slug leaves ragged holes. Spider mites leave fine stippling. A mine is a continuous trail that widens as it goes, because the insect was growing while it ate. Take the clump down to just above the crown. Gather every leaf and bag it, rather than composting mined foliage. Then leave the plant alone and let it push a fresh set of leaves to finish the season with. 1 honest limit, because I would rather tell you than have you disappointed. These leaf miners spend the winter as pupae down in the soil, not up in the leaves. Cutting does not sterilize the bed. It removes this round of insects and hands the plant clean foliage. Give it 2 or 3 weeks and you should have a low, tidy mound of fresh leaves carrying the plant into fall. If you want the free extra, turn over the top inch of soil around the plant in late fall so the freeze can reach some of those pupae. Your move, mined and finished, cut and bag. Still mostly green, leave it be. Bee balm, Monarda. And with this one, the common mistake is not in the shears. It is in the spray bottle. Verdict first. If the flowers are done, most of the leaves have gone white or brown, and there is clean new growth at the base. Cut it. If it is still blooming and the mildew is light, leave it. Light powdery mildew is something you can live with, and the plant certainly can. Now, the part worth knowing. For established powdery mildew, most home garden fungicides are far better at protecting clean tissue than at restoring leaves that are already coated. Once the majority of the foliage is white, spraying is mostly closing a barn door. That is not an argument against fungicides in general. It is an argument about timing and about when to stop reaching for one. And most of us were taught that mildew means wet, which is only half true. Powdery mildew does its best work where the canopy is thick, where the air inside the clump has nowhere to go, and where nights turn cool and damp. It gets noticeably worse in the crowded, shaded parts of a plant. So the real question in late August is not what to spray. It is why nothing is moving through the middle of that clump. Cut it down, carry the diseased material out of the bed, and then do the thing almost everybody skips. Kneel down and look at the crown you just uncovered. If it is a solid mat of stems, packed like a doormat, that is where next year's mildew begins. Tie a ribbon on it so you remember to dig and divide it in spring. Bee balm generally wants dividing every 2 or 3 years, full sun, and a couple of feet of room between plants. And if you are replacing a monarda that mildews badly every single year, no matter what you do, the older resistant selections, Marshall's Delight and Jacob Klein, are worth asking for by name at the nursery. As for how low, take it down to about a hand's width above the ground, just above that fresh basil growth, and do not cut down through the new shoots. Within 2 or 3 weeks, you should have a low green mound. It will not flower again, and that is fine. You are not chasing a second bloom here. You are lowering the amount of fungus that goes into winter in that spot. 6 inches of empty air between stems works every year and costs nothing. That is most likely why you have heard about the spray 100 times and about the spacing maybe twice. Your move. Finished and white. Cut. Still blooming and lightly dusted. Wait. Hollyhock. And now we come back to that paper towel. Verdict first, and this is the clearest cut now case in the whole video. If flowering is over and the leaves are covered in yellow-orange spots, cut those stalks near the soil line and take every bit of it out of the bed. Here is what you are looking at. Turn a bad leaf over. On top, yellow or orange spots. Directly beneath them, raised bumps, brown to dark red, packed close together. Those bumps are where the spores are made. Badly hit leaves develop small holes and go lacy before they shrivel. The towel test works because rust spores come off on a wipe. Leaf spot does not smear. Sunscald does not smear. Rust does. Now the part that separates a cleanup that works from one that does not, and it has nothing to do with the hollyhock itself. Look at the ground around it. This rust does not only live on hollyhocks, it lives on other members of the mallow family, and that includes common mallow, the low sprawling weed with round scalloped leaves and the little seed pods children used to call cheeses. Pull those out too. You can cut the hollyhocks perfectly, bag every leaf, feel wonderful about it, and then have the rust walk right back in next May from a weed growing 3 feet away by the downspout. Do not just clean the plant, clean its neighborhood. One small technique that matters more than it sounds. Do not shake the stalks as you carry them across the yard. Slide them into a bag right where they stand, because a good shake is a spore broadcast. And one honest caveat. This fungus can also survive in the plant's own tissue at the base, not only in fallen leaves. A thorough cleanup meaningfully lowers your pressure next year. It does not promise you a spotless plant next June, and anyone who says otherwise is selling something. Your move. Orange on the towel and flowering done. Cut low and pull the mallow. No orange dust, no urgency. Daylily. This is the plant I teased, and it holds the biggest surprise in the video. By late August, a daylily clump often looks terrible. Yellow, brown, streaked, flopping outward. And what you will hear almost everywhere is, cut it down, because the disease overwinters in that foliage. For most of the country, that sentence is not correct. Here is the 10-second test. Run your finger, or that paper towel, down the underside of a bad leaf. Orange dust that smears means daylily rust. A yellow streak running down the center vein, starting near the tip and browning as the tissue dies, with no dust at all, means daylily leaf streak. 2 completely different fungi, and they call for 2 different reactions. Daylily rust arrived in this country around the year 2000 and spread quickly. But researchers at the University of Massachusetts found that it does not survive their winters, and it generally does not make it through anywhere plants die back hard to the crown after a freeze. It lives year-round in the warm south. In the north, it usually has to be brought back in on new nursery stock. So if you garden in Michigan or Minnesota or upstate New York, cutting your daylilies on September 1st does not stop rust from overwintering. Rust was not going to overwinter there anyway. Leaf streak is the one that does. It spends the winter in old Daylily leaf debris and produces the spores that start the whole thing again each spring. So your verdict depends on what the leaf tells you. Streaked and browning with flowering finished. Cut the foliage back and take the debris out of the bed, because that cleanup genuinely pays. Orange dust in the warm south. Same answer, and be careful about moving new plants around. And if a daylily is simply brown because August was hot and dry, with no dust and no streak down the midrib, that is not disease at all. Pull the loose dead leaves that come away with a gentle tug and let the green ones keep working. When you do cut, leave a few inches above the crown rather than scalping it flush to the ground. And while you are down there, if the clump has grown into a dense mound, this is the season to do something about it. The window for dividing daylilies runs from just after bloom through early fall in most of the country, which means you can actually finish the job this year instead of only marking it. Tight clumps hold moisture, leaves stay wet longer, and wet leaves are how this thing travels. Your move: streak or dust, cut and clear. Brown from heat alone, tidy it and leave it. Garden phlox. The tall, fragrant one that carries the border into fall. Verdict first. If the flower display is essentially over, the lower foliage has gone brown from the ground up, and mildew has taken most of what is left, cut those stems and clear the debris. If it is still throwing flowers and there are still bees working it in the afternoon, leave it standing. Late nectar is worth more than a tidy bed. Now, the complaint I hear constantly. I bought the mildew-resistant variety, and it is still white by August. That is not a contradiction. Resistant does not mean immune. Resistant means slower. Under enough pressure, almost any phlox will mildew eventually. The good selections simply hold clean foliage through bloom, which is exactly when you want it. And underneath all of this, there is a fair question. At some point in the season, you are no longer treating a plant. You are protecting leaves that the plant was about to drop anyway. That is the moment to stop spraying and start cutting. When you do cut, look at the crown again. A phlox clump that has sat undisturbed for 4 or 5 years has almost no air moving through its middle, and that congestion, more than the weather, is what you are actually fighting. Mark it for spring division. As for how low, take phlox down to a few inches. Do not leave long, hollow stubs standing, because they collect water over the winter. And here is something I want to be clear about, because it matters more than any one plant. Diseased tissue and standing habitat are not the same thing. The goal is not a garden that looks like a swept floor in November. Take out the mildewed stems. Leave the healthy ones, the late flowers, the seed heads. Targeted, not sterile. Your move: mildewed and finished, cut. Still blooming. Leave it for the pollinators. Garden lilies. Asiatic, Oriental, the tall, fragrant ones by the porch steps. Verdict first, and this one is genuinely split. If brown blotches are climbing up the stem and whole leaves have gone papery and dead, cut that stem to the ground and bag it. If the foliage is still green, leave it alone, because every green leaf is still feeding the bulb for next year. The disease is botrytis blight. Old lily growers call it fire, because in a wet week it moves like one. It begins as small brown spots on the lower leaves. The spots merge, the leaf dies, and it climbs. And here is the confusion I want to clear up, because this is the one people get wrong. Lily foliage that yellows evenly from the bottom of the stem upward late in the season, with no spots on it, is completely normal. That is the plant emptying its leaves and moving everything down into the bulb. Blight looks different. Blight is spots first, brown patches with defined edges, and it can take hold on a stem that is otherwise still green. What earns it a place on this list is where it spends the winter. Botrytis forms small, hardened survival bodies on dead stems and leaves that stay lying in the bed. In spring, those release spores onto the new shoots coming up directly underneath. A lily that was blighted this year, left standing, is aimed straight at next year's shoots from a few inches away. So the blighted stems come out now. Clean green stems stay until they yellow, and then everything comes out at the end of the season. Do not shred that material into the bed, and do not put it on compost you plan to return to the same spot. One quick safety note while we are here. If you have cats, keep lily trimmings where they cannot reach them. True lilies are seriously toxic to cats. Your move: brown climbing the stem, cut it out. Still green, it is still working. Black-eyed Susan. Rudbeckia. And if you have ever looked at a bed of goldsturm in late August and thought it looked scorched, this one is for you. Verdict first. If the leaves have gone from spotted to blotched to nearly black, and the plant is losing them from the bottom up, Cut the foliage back and remove it from the bed. If the leaves are clean and it is still flowering, leave every bit of it standing. Those black leaves are usually one of two things. Septoria leaf spot, a fungus, is the common one, starting as small dark spots on the lower leaves and merging upward. Angular leaf spot is bacterial, more serious, and it hits the old Goldsturm selection especially hard. You often cannot tell them apart by eye, and for our purposes you do not need to, because your response is the same. Jana Beckerman, the plant pathologist at Purdue, is direct about this one. Foliage should be cut back and removed from infected plants. Left alone year after year, heavy infection can strip a planting bare and eventually kill it. That is not a cosmetic problem. And the reason the cut matters is the same reason as the lily. These fungi overwinter in the debris right there at the base. The spores that start next June are sitting under that plant right now. And if you are simply tired of fighting it, there is a better answer than spraying every summer. A newer selection called American Gold Rush was chosen for much better resistance to this leaf spot, and it was named Perennial Plant of the Year a few seasons back. Replacing a chronically infected stand is sometimes cheaper, and a great deal less work than defending one. So cut the diseased foliage, bag it, thin out the volunteer seedlings so the planting is not standing shoulder to shoulder, and water at the soil rather than over the top. But here is where I want you selective rather than thorough. Those seed heads feed goldfinches well into the fall. If a stand is clean, leave the seed heads up. Take out the spotted leaves, not the whole ecosystem. Your move, black and defoliating, cut and bag, clean and blooming, leave it for the finches. Now put the shears down. Because two of the most popular perennials in American gardens show up on nearly every Cut It Before September list, and both of them belong on a different list entirely. The first is bearded iris. The reasoning you will hear sounds airtight. Iris borer is the worst pest iris has. It overwinters as eggs on old iris foliage, therefore clean it up now. Here is the trouble with now. The University of Minnesota Extension lays out the calendar plainly. The caterpillars move down into the soil in late summer, the moths emerge after that, and the females lay their eggs on old iris foliage in August and September. So think about what actually happens if you scalp your iris on September 1st. You remove the leaves. Then, over the following weeks, moths that are still flying come back and lay their eggs on whatever foliage is standing and on the debris at the base. Minnesota's own recommendation is to clean up iris beds any time after a hard frost, when the females are no longer laying. Cutting earlier is not more preventive. It usually just means cleaning the same bed twice. What you can do right now is spot work. Pull off individual leaves that are brown, mushy, or marked with water-soaked streaks. If a rhizome feels soft or smells sour, dig into it. But green iris foliage is still feeding that rhizome for next spring. Let it work. The second is herbaceous peony, and this one is not really a judgment call. Iowa State University Extension puts it in writing. Peony foliage should not be cut back until a hard freeze has finished it, because those leaves are still making food that gets stored down in the roots, and the more the plant stores, the better next spring's flowers. And then they add the sentence I want you carrying out to the garden with you. Plants cut back in August or early September may have fewer blooms than those cut back in fall. Fewer blooms. That is the trade you are making for a bed that looks tidier in September. When the freeze does come, absolutely cut that peony to the ground and take the foliage out, because it does carry disease from one year to the next. It simply gets that cleanup in November, not now. And I think that is the mark of a rule worth trusting. A good rule does not only tell you what to cut, it tells you what to leave alone. All right, you have a pile of foliage at your feet and shears in your hand. Let us finish the job properly. 5 things, and not one of them costs you anything. 1. Diagnose before you cut. 4 questions. Is flowering essentially finished? Is most of the foliage diseased or infested? Is there healthy new growth at the base? And can that pest or disease actually survive in this material? 3 or 4 yeses, cut. 1 yes, put the shears down. 2. Work when the foliage is dry. Wet leaves put spores on your gloves and your sleeves, and then onto the next healthy plant you touch. Late morning, once the dew has burned off, is the sweet spot. 3. Clean your blades when you move from clearly diseased material over to a healthy plant. No surgical ritual required. Wipe them or carry a rag with a little rubbing alcohol in your back pocket. It takes 4 seconds, and it is the difference between pruning and spreading. 4. Be honest about your compost pile. And here I am not going to give you the tidy answer, because the tidy answer is wrong. You will hear that all diseased material must go in the trash, always, no exceptions. That is overstated. A well-managed hot pile handles a great deal. But most backyard piles never get hot enough for long enough, and most of us eventually spread that finished compost right back into the same bed. So use this rule instead. If you do not know that your pile runs hot, keep heavily diseased material out of compost you plan to return to the bed it came from. And check your local yard waste rules, because they differ from town to town. 5. And this is the habit I promised you at the very beginning. After you cut a perennial hard in late summer, do not feed it. It feels right. The plant looks bare. You want to help it recover, so you reach for the fertilizer. Michigan State University Extension is direct about this. Do not fertilize perennials in late summer or early fall, because it can push a flush of soft growth that will not harden off before an early freeze. What a freshly cut plant wants is water. One deep, slow soaking if the soil is dry. That is the whole treatment. And write down what you found. A card in the potting shed that says which plant had what and where it was standing is worth more to you next May than anything you can buy, because disease pressure tends to repeat in the same spots. Then watch. Over the next 2 to 4 weeks, you should see clean new growth coming up at the base of the plants you cut. That is your confirmation that you read the plant correctly. So let me leave you with something simpler than 7 names. Cut hard when flowering is essentially finished, when most of the foliage is diseased or collapsing, when the pest or pathogen can genuinely survive in that tissue, and when there is a healthy crown underneath ready to carry on. Wait when the foliage is still green and working, when late flowers are still feeding pollinators, when there is no real disease pressure, and when the plant still needs those leaves to fill its roots for next year. Everything else is regional detail. I have put all of it into a free guide called the Late Summer Perennial Reset Guide. 7 plants to cut and 2 plants to leave alone. It has the symptom chart, the cut or wait call for each plant, how low to cut, what to do with the debris, and the 2 plants to leave standing. It is a large print, garden-friendly version you can carry outside with you. The link is in the description below, and there is a code on screen you can scan with your phone. And then tell me one thing in the comments. Your USTA zone, and which perennial looks worst in your yard right now. If you want to add what your mother or your grandmother did in the flower bed at the end of August, I would love to read it. Some of those old habits made a great deal more sense than we realized. Some of them did not. That is exactly why knowing the biology is worth the trouble. Take care of that soil, and I will see you next time.